Hello, and welcome back to the Let Me Add to That podcast. My name is Elizabeth Graswich, Executive Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. We are the largest regional education agency in the United States. We serve 80 school districts and nearly 2 million children. We are excited to use this platform to take a deep dive into the conversations surrounding our students and schools in LA County. Welcome back. This month we have a very special episode because a lot of district leaders, educators, and even students have been asking us about podcasting. We've gotten questions on how do you even start a podcast, what equipment do you really need, and everything in between. If you've thought about starting a podcast at your school or district, look no further. This episode will give you insight and best practices to get you started. And we are very excited because today we are coming to you from Spotify LA in downtown Los Angeles. And with us, we have Tiffany Cruz, a.k.a. T. Cruz, from Spotify's Podcasting Studios team. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This would actually be the first time I'm in front of the microphone. So that's a first versus behind the scenes making a podcast. So truly an honor to be here. So thank you for having me, Liz.
Well, we just love being here, and we're so excited to talk to you today because we've gotten so many questions about podcasting. So to start off with just telling us a little bit about yourself and your role at Spotify, especially as it relates to podcasting.
Sure thing. I'm a native Angelino and born and raised in Burbank, as surrounded by the various studios that kind of got me into where I am now. I graduated at Cal State Northridge, getting a degree in film and television. So focusing on video editing. So from the start, I've always was interested in production, post-production. Landing here at Spotify was more so in the music side of things, creating content for our flagship playlists. And then soon Spotify got into podcasts and acquired, the big impactful names in the podcast industry where we all collectively created original content. And my current role now is a post-production lead, and I oversee various original podcasts and video podcasts here. So it's very exciting, and it's a new space that I'm still learning every day of podcasts. So,
well, and I don't know if everyone knows that, here in LA, we have this great studio where we're sitting today. I mean, we're in this beautiful studio space right now, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited. And this is where you get to work.
Yes. No, it is a very great privilege. It's a dream. It's a dream to be here. And this space is amazing that we can cultivate and create amazing podcasts for everyone to listen and watch.
School districts and education communication professionals are always looking at how can they better improve their communications? How can they reach students, parents, teachers? And, I think podcasting offers another avenue for them. So why should they get involved in podcasting? What does it offer?
Yeah, I think schools and districts will have the advantage of creating a space that is easy, accessible, and digestible, especially when commuting to work, commuting to school, or just transitioning to place. I think podcasts is a great opportunity to provide information. And I see a lot of kids, they wear headphones, ear pods, all the things. They're listening to something. And I think it's a great reach to provide students, and podcasts can vary on time frames too. It doesn't need to be, that's what's so great about it. It's like, it doesn't need to be a specific length. It could be quick and snappy, 10 minutes. I've seen those daily podcasts, just like a 10-minute update, whereas I think traditionally a lot of people think podcasts are in the longer end of 40 minutes to 90 minutes. But there really isn't a guide, just kind of like TV days or broadcast TV. It's like a specific formula. Podcast is kind of Wild Wild West in a sense. It really is what you as the content creator would want it to be.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point. I mean, even, there's you can just do the sound, or you were showing us here in the studio, there's also the option for video. But I think for so many of us, like, it's kind of nice to not have the video on and just do the sound. So it really provides a level of comfort, right?
Right. It's really your choosing, whatever your comfort level is, whatever you are looking for in sharing and providing the information to listeners. You kind of have that control, which is awesome.
Well, and with everything new, right, it's also like, where do you start? How do you even get started? How do you map it out? And, so what would be the advice you'd give to people as they're starting to think about, okay, I want to start a podcast. Now what?
It is a very great question. I mean, it is daunting. There are so many podcasts out there. You could just name something, you'll find it. I think some nice first steps to consider is the publishing cadence. Like, how often do you plan to publish an episode for listeners, viewers to tune in? You got to set a schedule. I think setting a schedule and keeping track and sticking to it is the best way to keep you accountable in ensuring you have a podcast season. You set that limit, whether it is 12 episodes, whether it is 24 episodes a year or 48, where it's like, okay, you're really weekly. What I found to be true, especially here at Spotify, weekly is a nice spot for a lot of our shows, and shows in general for all podcasts alike. It's the engagement where your hope is to grow that audience, keep them engaged, stay relevant, and figuring out who your target audience will be is another one. What sort of topics will pique your listener or viewer's interest. And one cool feature here to plug in for Spotify, there's this Q&A and polls feature where podcasters can engage and interact with their listeners, which can help increase consumption of the show. And obviously, social media is a friend to podcasts. It's a great avenue for gaining followers and choosing bites or segments from your podcast that you can highlight and gain interest for new listeners to tune in. If there's a specific topic you're covering too, that can be like a shareable clip where you can help reach a broader audience.
Yeah, that's interesting because when we do our podcast, we're so fortunate. We have Nora Robinson, one of our fabulous team members, who sits with us, and she's sitting with us now, and she's listening and looking for those clips. And that's how we try to draw audience members to the fuller podcast. I didn't know about the polling feature, though, so after this, I'm like super excited to check that out. What about, should you pick a particular day? Like, should you always post like on the same day each week, or like at the same time? Does that kind of thing matter?
One, to answer your question, I think it needs to be consistent. Mm-hmm. So if you are doing this weekly, you got to choose a day in the week that you feel like your viewers or listeners can tune in. And timing, sometimes it just defaults to midnight. Mm-hmm. But again, that's your choosing. And that's your deadlines that you kind of have to set for you and the team to have this weekly cadence and that structure each week. So I do notice midweek, I don't see a lot of it on Fridays. Like, it's normally like a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Because, the weekends,
sure,
it gets overlooked. But during the week, that's when a lot of people are commuting, going to work, just passing time by, so I think those are the best windows to showcase a podcast.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, especially even though we have so many people working remote and hybrid lately, still, I mean, we're in LA County, right? And I mean, all of us spend hours on the road. So, during the week, perfect.
Traffic.
Right. Traffic.
LA traffic.
Right. Exactly. Right. Listen to a podcast. So I'm a podcaster now. I've like kind of planned out my podcast, but then I'm going, oh wait, now I need equipment. So what would you recommend when someone's starting out and they're trying to think about equipment and software? What should they look at?
Most definitely during the pandemic or post-pandemic, I think the podcast boom, right? Like everyone's home, they were able to plug in a microphone or even using their iPhone headphones with the little speaker. Like
Sure.
the scrappiness of it is what's so cool for podcasting. Like you could be at any level to create one. But to highlight or suggest some recommendations, I do find a dynamic mic is best. Brands like Shure, Rode, and Newman is what we're using right now. There are so many tools out there. But I think depending on how much production value you want your podcast to have, that's kind of, your taste. And ensuring you are recording in a quiet location helps the feasibility of listening to a podcast. Because if you're a listener, you also don't want to hear like these scratchy noises or like a car horn in the background, sure. whatnot, So just keeping that in mind. In terms of software recommendations, I do think Pro Tools and Adobe Audition are the best bet for a more professional way to go. But again, there are other DAWs, if you will. That's a digital audio space workstation that are out there. So for students, if they already have an Apple computer or an iMac, like GarageBand's already on there. There's also a free tier option called Descript that's out there to get your first start. One of the reasons why I also mentioned Descript, that's kind of it's a new tool, but they have this neat feature where you can automatically upload your podcast and publish directly to Spotify.
Nice.
After you're done editing and working on your podcast. So you can record, edit, and publish on Descript.
So you can really start from very, very low cost to obviously a lot more. And that's what's kind of cool about it, right? There's a place to entry and then you can always level up if that's something you want to do.
For sure.
So then you're like needing to move into like planning the actual episode. And, one of my favorite parts is the storytelling of it. And so what advice would you give to someone who's like going, okay, now I know what my podcast is going to be called. I know when I want to publish. Like, what's the storytelling?
That is great. Again, podcast is another storytelling medium. So it really depends on what type of podcast you're creating, right? So as you're planning, what are you focusing on? It's just like any movie or script that, producers are making out there. So from a scripted standpoint, we want to kind of keep in mind what are the soundscapes that you're trying to create for the listeners. How do you want them to feel in that moment? So like a lot of music cues, sound effects come into play. You're setting the tone for your listeners. So that's something to be mindful of. And I do tend to notice, not all, but I tend to notice like these scripted podcasts are in the shorter end or they're limited series. So it's a weekly cadence, but it's for a short amount of time. So whether it's like 6 to 10 weeks instead of a full always on year round podcast. So that's something to keep in mind. But for the most part, I think there's a lot more conversational podcasts, just like what we're having right now, where for our conversational podcast, there tends to be, there is a structure. Like there's that intro. There are the topics you want to cover that you can kind of do your research on beforehand. And then the conclusion at the end, and you kind of do your thank yous, or like a rapid fire of questions at the end too. I've seen that where they put the guests on the spot and ask these this or that or something like that. So they make it fun. But those are in like the longer podcasts. And what I do tend to notice for the longer ones, there are chances for ad breaks. So if you're looking into monetization, that's one thing. How many ad breaks can you get into the podcast? That's going on a different level. Sometimes people aren't looking for the monetization aspect of podcasting. It really depends on what what your focus is on and what you want to gain from publishing your podcast. Everyone has their own motives, but there are formulas, but it's really what you want it to be.
That's what's so cool about it, though, right?
The flexibility, yeah. Like there's so many different flavors of it. So, as mentioned before, keeping the audience kind of hooked each time. So it's good to keep it weekly. There's other times I do see podcasts that do it twice a week or 3 times a week. I'm like, oh man, how many days do you have to turn this around?
Right.
It could be whatever flavor you kind of want it to be. How to keep the momentum going for your podcast is essentially a nice way to also grow your audience network.
Well, because that's ultimately what we're all trying for, right? And there's so many podcasts out there, and so it's like, how do you differentiate, and then how do you engage people? So I know Spotify, is a great platform to do that. But what are your tips for folks that are now they have their podcast, they're up and going. How do they get listeners to their podcast?
Yeah, for one, catchy titles. I do love it that this is, let me add to that, just like, hey, wait, I have this to, catchy titles gets you like interested,
Sure.
That's really what you're trying to get, that hook. It's just like a trailer for movies. Like, how can I get audience members to tune in, right? So catchy titles, descriptors, the description of your podcast is always helpful. So something very short, concise, again, like a movie, a trailer, tagline, and your artwork, the key art, because that's what they're going to see on, when you help promote it on social media. Now have you, if it is an audio only, that's one question that gets asked, like, how do you promote that on social? What visuals are you going to use?
Sure.
So that's where the key art for the podcast comes in handy. And adding subtitles, make it dynamic. A lot of people do the little wavelengths on their audiograms, as I think some people call it. So the key art is very helpful for gaining interest in listeners. And there's also another feature, I'm going to say this, on Spotify that's pretty cool, that can help promote your podcast. Is there's a Spotify code. It's almost like a QR code. It's a scannable tag, essentially. If you look on the app, you can basically scan. It's like the Spotify logo and a bunch of wavelengths. That wavelength will bring you to your podcast, essentially.
Oh, nice.
So it's kind of cool. I've started to see people make stickers of it and put it on places,
that's cool.
and then you scan it, and it'll take you to your podcast or your music. A lot of up and coming musical artists do that too. So that's a cool little feature that's Spotify only that I know of, that you can put that on a shirt or something. Or
That's awesome. We're taking notes too for our podcast, so thank you.
Yeah. So that's a little cool thing. And on another side note, I think someone got it tattooed on them. I was
wow.
Oh my God. They tattooed one of their favorite songs on them, and someone scanned it and it worked.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
Wild.
Now, you've been in the production space your whole career. So I think, for a lot of people, it's just really intimidating. I mean, I'm so lucky I have a team that helps me. But, so are there tips that you would give people, especially people maybe who are starting out, related to recording, editing, and just kind of so that they can have as high production value as possible if they're starting out and kind of still learning?
Yeah. Again, I'm learning every day. Technology keeps changing too. I'm just like, how do I keep up? And I don't want to say it, but yes, AI is coming in and doing things. But for one thing, I definitely do want to give the advice of like, it's okay to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how you learn. I've done plenty. And that's how I learned how to like, okay, that's how I should avoid that next time, and also troubleshoot. So there is going to be moments of challenge and also learning from those mistakes going forward. But what's also great is that, I grew up in a different time where I can't Google things, right? I think for the generation now and coming forward, is just like there's so much information to your disposal that you can learn all this from finding something online, and be self-taught. So there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of options, whether, like I mentioned, there's different DAWs out there that you can choose from. It still does the basic needs of editing. You could sound mix it, making sure it's leveled to the certain specs that you need your podcast to be, or your music. There's a lot out there, and it's great to see. There's a lot of creativity in this world that you can go out and create, be a content creator.
Well, it's so cool. And I think about like our kids doing it, our students doing it, right? I mean, there's critical thinking involved. And that is, I mean, of all industries, right? We're about learning. And so, there is room for mistakes. I'm so glad you pointed that out. Again, but as people are starting to think about it, they may be thinking about upcoming challenges. Is there things that they can do that would maybe like make it a little smoother? Are there tips around that?
Yeah. Again, what's so great about podcasting and just things in post-production in general, if you have the time, the bandwidth, and the turnaround, you can edit things around. So one thing I do recommend is record as long as you can, rather than starting and stopping. Just let it roll. Just let that camera roll. If you have the hard drive space to allow for it, you could edit unwanted stuff later on, and you can reshape it the way you've envisioned. Because like I said, you're gonna make mistakes, you're gonna fumble, you're gonna have to misspeak. So that's what's so great. And another thing to add, making sure for your microphones, each person is mic'd up. I think there might be times where people don't think like they share a microphone. That's going to be a lot more difficult and challenging in post-production to edit down, because you don't have an isolated track of that person speaking. So I think I got a little deep onto nuance there, but that's something I just want to speak of. Like, Liz and I have our own microphones right now. We're speaking to our own mics. So ensuring you have enough equipment for your hosts and guests, just that to keep in mind, and making sure you have a dedicated person that can edit, engineer, and do all the things. Shout out Robert, to make sure that you get a podcast packaged ready to go by that deadline.
I think that's so important. I mean, that's stuff like we take for granted, right? But you're right. I mean, people may not think about that.
Right. Like you said, like the production of it, like it's nice to just be surrounded and just put yourself in those elements of learning production and observing, right? I think that's a great way to learn everything that goes into podcasting in general. But that goes beyond podcasting as well. Just being observant, being patient, and a great listener. So there is one thing I do want to talk about the script again, which is there's a cool feature on there where it can auto transcribe your podcast or video, where not everyone wants to listen to the 40-minute episode. So there's like what we do as our workflow here, and I'm sure other places too. We create a transcript. You can do like a paper edit. You choose parts of the podcast from that transcript. There's time code on it, and then you could edit down what we call it a paper edit. You could edit it down the way you want it by reading it on paper instead of listening. So, and you could keyword search like, oh, where's this part where they said this? Like that can be a nice and helpful tool to get ahead. You have that as a script essentially.
Wow, I had no idea that was even a possibility. So we're like learning all these things. So our listeners are going to like be hearing this like even better podcast moving forward after we incorporate some of this into our podcasting. That's awesome.
Yes. No, I'm glad I could share some of these things. Like, yeah, there's easier ways to do it. And also another feature that is, I think, available on all platforms. You could ×2 speed things to get through
Sure.
a podcast. If you don't have the time, if you can't listen to the 90 minutes, then you could chop it in half by speeding up the playback of the podcast.
Interesting. You know, you may or may not know the answer to this, but you just made me think of something. Sometimes it feels like when you're listening to podcasts, they do go faster, or like someone has sped them up. Does that happen where they maybe you'll even speed it up a little bit in like post-production or slow it down?
It's without a doubt. It's possible. Yes,
Sure.
It's definitely possible. Again, there are so many podcasts out there. I'm sure there is some that do that. I don't know any personally, but
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
As I listen, sometimes I'm like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like the normal cadence. So. You know, one of the other things that I think may be confusing for people is around the whole copyright, licensing issues. You know, people want to have music at the beginning and end of their podcast. How do they navigate that? What is your advice for them?
yeah. First off, I want to say I'm not part of the rights and clearance team or a lawyer, but as a suggestion, if in doubt, it's always good to ask legal counsel for any advice on this matter.
Yeah.
But there are great resources out there. So in terms for music, there's a ton of stock libraries that you could choose from where there's like a minimal subscription fee for the year, that you could keyword search what you're looking for, what vibe you're looking for your podcast, and it's there. And it gives you the licensing agreement as needed. If you do a little bit more digging, there's royalty-free music available online that you can look for, music and effects, so you could tap into that if needed. It's always good to give credit where credit's due, so just double check where your sources are coming from before publishing a podcast to avoid, those licensing issues. But I do also want to add that there are a lot of topics discussed in podcasts as well that might not be suitable for the younger audiences.
Great point.
So I do suggest putting something similar to like a trigger warning at the beginning of the podcast so you don't catch listeners off guard on topics that might, provoke them in a certain way. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, that's some things to watch out for.
What advice do you have for promoting and marketing educational podcasts effectively to reach a wider audience?
I would say creating a trailer is very beneficial for promoting and marketing educational podcasts. Something that's short, digestible summary of what your podcast covers. And that trailer can live on social media as well. Sometimes if you have a great clip from the podcast that can go viral, that's always something that everyone's banking on. But another thing I would like to suggest is also creating a, on your show feed, creating a best place to start, essentially makes it easier for first-time listeners to jump into your podcast by featuring picking one podcast episode that you think will hook your audience. Essentially, if you have multiple episodes, like where do you want to start? Like there's so many topics. But if there's, that gold star episode that you want to showcase and highlight, I think that would be a nice. It's basically like pinning it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In social media, you pin your highlight video. This is you pinning your podcast that you want new listeners, new viewers to come and pick and choose that particular episode and hopefully gain traction for them to click on another episode or listen to something else from your podcast list. So
that's a great idea. I didn't even realize that was something we could do. So again, learning from you today. Thank you. As we close, Spotify has been, very supportive of the education community. What are some of the things that Spotify offers for educational podcasters, features or resources?
Yeah. Podcasts are continuing to grow and thrive, and you name it, there's probably a podcast out there for you. So I do want to say, I hope I can say this, but in the new year, there will be an opportunity for podcast creators to tap into this creator program partnerships through Spotify, where we provide resources, education, and podcasting, and the like, and even the possibility of opening our studio space where we are right now to support creators who are investing their time and creativity into podcasting. So that's definitely a mission that Spotify is trying to cultivate a foundation for the future to help creatives succeed in this medium. And you can definitely follow us at Spotify Podcasts, where you see all our podcasts related information, shows, all the things. But I'm sure there will be more information on what the creator program will be coming soon.
Well, that makes me excited because I would love to come back to Spotify LA. It is such a cool space. It's got a great vibe and super friendly people. So thank you for that. Just thank you for joining us. It's just been a great episode. And again, you've just been so generous with your time and allowing us to come into your space.
Yes, anytime. You're more than welcome. Hit me up. I do want to thank Leandro Otero for introducing me to LACO. This is such a nice opportunity. So I'm just glad I was able to connect with you all. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I want to echo that shout out to Leandro with Soundtrap. He has been so helpful to us here at LACO as well. I'm glad he connected us. So there you have it. Podcasting 101 with Spotify podcasting expert T. Cruz. Follow us on social media at Los Angeles COE. And if you have any questions about starting a podcast at your school, drop a comment and we'll be happy to connect with you. Until next time, happy podcasting.
Please follow the Los Angeles County Office of Education on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Los Angeles COE. That's Los Angeles COE. Or you can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn at Los Angeles County Office of Education.